Hey everybody, Brian Marvel here. Hope that you're doing well and welcome back. This is our fourth installment in answering the question, what is the Bible all about? And what we've been saying in these videos is that the best way to read and understand the Bible is through the lens of a story. The Bible is basically the story of who God is and what He has done in and through the person of Jesus Christ, and what He is calling us to do as we partner with Him to carry on His work in the world. And so what we're doing with these videos is we're looking at the big picture scope of the storyline of the Bible through different vantage points and perspectives. And in this video, we want to explore the story of the Scriptures through the lens of God's presence. And where we need to start is once again at the beginning. And what we said earlier in one of our videos is that the Bible opens up with God creating everything. He creates this great world, He calls it good, and then on His final day of creation, He creates humanity, Adam and Eve, and He places them in this good world that He has created to partner with Him, to live in His presence, and to co-labor with Him in caring for the good world that He has just made. But it only takes a few pages into the story of the Scriptures before we see things start to go sideways. In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve do the one thing that God tells them not to do. They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and instantly sin and death and destruction and brokenness enter into the world and fracture the good world that God has created. And part of the consequence of their sin is that they have to leave not only the garden, but they also have to leave God's presence. And we're told that God escorts them out of the garden on the east side of the garden. Now, if you keep reading Genesis, especially in the following chapters after Genesis 3, you'll notice that there is this continued movement eastward. So in Genesis 3, verse 24, they exit the garden on the east side. Then the next thing that happens is Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain grows jealous of Abel and murders his brother, and then after his death, we're told that Cain continues to move eastward. And then if you keep going to Genesis 11, you find that the people are continuing to move eastward, and they come to this place called Babel, and they build this tower reaching up to the heavens, trying to reach God so that they can dethrone God. And so you have this continual movement eastward, and as the people move east, things go from bad to worse. More sin, more death, more destruction enters the story. And some scholars say that this movement east is a literary device trying to capture that humanity is moving further and further and further away from God's presence, away from God's original intent for the way things were designed to be. Now, God in His goodness, God in His graciousness, doesn't let humanity just go off on their own, but He devises a plan to bring them back into His presence. And His first move in bringing them back into His presence is in the book of Exodus. We said last week that in the book of Exodus, God's people, the Israelites, move to Egypt. They are enslaved in Egypt, and after a few hundred years, God rescues and redeems them from slavery in Egypt and leads them to the promised land. And the way that God guides them from Egypt to the promised land is in part through a pillar of cloud. He becomes this pillar of cloud, and we're told in Exodus that He leads them by day as a pillar of cloud, and then by night as a pillar of fire. And this is supposed to symbolize God's presence with them. But then once they get out in the desert, in the wilderness, their leader, Moses, we said, goes up on this mountain and he receives the law from God. Now there's this huge stretch in the law that's just basically instructions on how to create a temple. And the significance of the temple for the Israelites is this is where God is going to live amongst them. God essentially says, I'm not going to leave you just to wander on your own. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to dwell among you. And the significance of the temple was that it was thought this was the overlapping point between heaven and earth. It wasn't just that heaven was somewhere off in the skies, some far distance place, but heaven and earth actually overlapped in the temple because that's where God's presence lived. But then you fast forward to the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we see that Jesus comes on the scene. And there's this story where Jesus is telling the religious leaders of his day to go ahead and destroy the temple. He says, destroy that building and I will resurrect it in 3 days. Now, what Jesus is not suggesting is essentially a new construction project, but what he's referring to is himself, his death, his resurrection, because after he's crucified, he raises from the dead 3 days later. And essentially, Jesus is making a statement that what the temple was doing for the Israelites, and that this was the place where God's presence dwelt, was now happening with him. Essentially, he was the new and better temple. He was God's presence in the flesh. Then, after his resurrection, after 40 days, he leaves to go back to the Father, and he says, once I leave, I am going to send the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will come and dwell within you. Essentially saying, here's one of my final moves. No longer is it the temple, no longer is it me, but now I'm sending the Holy Spirit to reside in you. And Paul will say later in the New Testament that our bodies are a temple, meaning we now are the overlapping point between heaven and earth because we have God's presence residing in us. And so what you have in this story is God loving his people to the point where he goes after them. He goes after them to lead them, to guide them, to dwell amongst them, to send his son to die for them, and then to be within us so that we can continue to call people back to God, back to his presence, back to communing with him and partnering with him the way that he intended it to be. And so here's just another real quick snapshot of what the Bible is all about. It's about living with God, communing with him, being in relationship, partnering with him, co-laboring with him to carry on his good work in this world that he started ages and ages ago. Hope this video was helpful. I know it's a flyby, it's real quick, it's real fast, but my hope is that it inspires you to take another look at the scriptures and keep asking questions and keep wondering, what is this book all about? Come back again next time. We'll take another look at answering the question, what is the Bible all about, in a new and fresh way. Have a great rest of your day. Grace and peace to you.